It is Spooky Source Saturday. Oh, I don't know if you saw that I just manifested a cattail out of my ear. Spooky Source Saturday. I am Dr. Samantha Cotrera for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. Source Saturday is a series I have been doing since the fall, talking to historians and creators and archivists about particular sources and talking about how they can challenge a more traditional way that we often teach and learn history. And because I like a good theme and like an opportunity to buy a themed new dress, I put out a call for anyone doing spooky types of history. And I'm putting them together in this series of 5 different Source Saturday videos, Spooky Source Saturday videos, talking about things from graves to hauntings to like ghost walks, and like it's a very cool collection of things. And I did not think that I was going to like learn more about history doing these like spooky conversations. I thought I would just like get to know different aspects of the history, but I have learned so much. And so this introduction is the same for everyone. Then we'll do the introduction for the individual speaker, and then we'll do the video. So I hope you enjoy them as much as I do. They're posting before Halloween so that you can incorporate these ideas into your classroom the week before Halloween. Please comment below if you did incorporate any of these videos into your classroom and what the response was from your students. So let's go over to Zoom. In this video, and we have Betty already, we have B here already for it, where I'm talking with Dr. Kyle Falcon. Dr. Falcon is a specialist in World War I, but he looks at World War I and spiritualism. So this notion of communicating with the spirits and why it was such an important part of World War I culture and after World War I when so many young men had died. But we're not talking about World War I today. We're going to be talking about the 1920s and the 1930s. So just after the war, and we are going to be listening to audio of a seance, which is just so cool. B is very excited about that too. Look at her. We're going to be listening to the audio of a seance, which is really cool to be able to access this type of technology from almost 100 years ago. So let's go over to Zoom. Hopefully B is ready and talk to Dr. Falcon. Kyle, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to me for this like spooky little series. I think your work on like seances and spiritualism is just like perfect in this spooky vein, and I'm really excited for our conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Kyle Falcon. I completed my PhD in history at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. I studied spiritualism and psychical research in the aftermath of the Great War in Britain, as well as some Dominion countries such as Canada, but mostly Britain. And I was just interested in how the war stimulated an interest in all things spiritual and psychical. So looking at things like prophecies and seances and ghost sightings and telepathy, all that sorts of weird spooky things as it related to the British War experience. I'm currently a research assistant at the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies. Bit of a long-winded name, but we basically study military history, war and society, Canadian military history. I'm currently working on my own podcast called War in the Weird, and it's going to be about basically weird war stories. So the inaugural episode will hopefully be ready in time before Halloween, and it will look at the famous story of the Angels of Mons during the First World War.
And I'll put a link to that below the video so that people can kind of follow that through, because that'd be really cool to listen to as well.
Excellent, thank you.
And I mean, we didn't really talk about this, but like, what got you interested in this topic?
So actually it was during my undergrad in a 4th-year seminar, we were reading a memoir by a Canadian soldier in the First World War, Willard Byrd. And he claims in the memoir is actually called Ghosts Have Warm Hands, that he was rescued from certain death by the ghost of his dead brother who went missing during the First World War. and was presumed killed, although they never found his body. And I just found that very fascinating because my impression of the First World War was very different at the time. It's kind of a very quintessential modern war, a war involving tanks, airplanes, submarines, gas. You don't really expect to see kind of miracles and ghosts in that kind of environment, at least not intuitively. So I was just really fascinated by that, and it kind of always stuck with me. And when I was looking for a PhD topic, I just kept coming back to the issue of the supernatural in the First World War.
Kind of like when you say it like that, it does. I also think of it as a very modern war, but I mean, I guess some of this is like echoes of late Victoriana, right? Like, and so some of these like young men that were fighting, those would have been their grandparents. And so, yeah. I don't know. It's interesting because
parents and grandparents,
yeah, because I so often talk about how we learn history and we teach history often in these historic spaces, these time periods that don't have any continuity with each other. And like this series is supposed to help us challenge those historic spaces. But one of the things that's coming up so much from these conversations is all of those, that time in between, and how we like need to look more closely at the connections between these different time periods, because, you know, it's the same families, it's the same like legacies. It's interesting.
Yep, there's a lot of Victoriana to it for sure.
Interesting. Okay, so what is the source that you are sharing with us today? And it is different than other sources that we've talked about because it's an audio source, which is really awesome. So this is a different type of source because it is a sound source, and there's a lot of different sources here. If I go down here, you know, you can see the different 1978, 1980s, 1954, but we are focusing on these two, if I'm correct, right? Gladys in 1932 and 1933, right?
You got it.
Okay, so what is this source, and should we play it, or do you want to say something about it first?
So this source is a gramophone recording of Séance conducted in the early 1930s. And it's with the famous British medium Gladys Osborne Leonard. Probably most listeners haven't heard of her, but if you're interested in the occult and the paranormal, her name pops up a lot. She became famous during actually the First World War when the physicist Sir Oliver Lodge came into contact with what he believed to be the spirit of his dead son who died during the First World War through this medium, Mrs. Leonard. And what you're hearing in this first clip is, as I said, a gramophone recording of a seance with her spirit control Theta. So the spirit control was kind of this intermediate personality who would come through in trance through the medium, and who would relay messages from the deceased, supposedly from the afterlife. So it's not, so if you conducted a seance with Mrs. Leonard, you usually wouldn't hear actual dialogue from the spirit that you're trying to contact, but instead through kind of this intermediate spirit control. And her name is, the spirit control has a personality, has a history, has her own identity separate from Mrs. Leonard, and she was said to be the ghost of a 13-year-old deceased East Indian. So she talks, as you'll notice during this clip, she kind of has almost like a childlike demeanor to her. Very high-pitched voice. She mixes up her R's and her L's. She has goofy nicknames for her sitters. So she was said to be the spirit of a child. And when listening to this, it's interesting to bear in mind that it's actually a grown woman who they're talking to. Mrs. Leonard in the 1930s, I believe, would have been either in her 40s or her 50s. So it's a grown woman personifying this kind of childlike character.
Okay, so let's listen. And this idea of a spirit control is not actually uncommon with psychics and those who give seances, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so let's give it a listen. And it's spooky. Like, I've listened to it, so I'm just like warning people. There's a little spooky to hear.
Yes, Frida. Good morning, Frida. Good morning, Frida. Good morning, good morning. Hi, am I going to be a carpet? Yes. This morning? Yes. Is that what the bee's for? That's right, yes. I can hear the bees buzzing. Can you? It isn't the one that got down Mr. Bill's collar. You know, I'm nearly headed his neck. No, dear. No, it's a compost glove. I wonder if it's a compost.
She sounds a little bit like Elmo.
Yes, she does. I got that feeling too, definitely.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the content. So when people do listen, they can like listen for certain things. Okay.
Great.
All right. So, okay. Did you want to listen to the second one too before we talked about like what you read from the source?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
that would be great. Yeah.
And then there's this one from 1933, same woman, but different with a different person, right?
Yeah. So in this one, instead of hearing her spirit controlled theta, what you're actually hearing is something called what was called direct voice. And so in this one, we have the Reverend Charles Drayton Thomas actually speaking with the spirit of someone he knew during life. I can't tell for certain who from the recording itself. It was probably the spirit of his father, if I were to guess. And so in this one, you'll notice that although it's the same medium, we're getting a very different voice coming through. We're getting a masculine voice instead of that of a child.
But it's the same woman.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And this one is kind of creepy.
Yes, if you speak just as you do usually, it'll be quite right. Well, that's very curious. I heard, as it were, Peter's voice, and thought you were imitating her. Oh, I was trying to get rid of her, Charlie. Oh, did she want to come in for a little bit? Yes. Sandwiching in. What I was trying to do was not to try to come in at all, but to try and let me sleep as I wanted to sleep. Oh, yes.
So that low voice is the same woman that did that theta voice, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And like, yeah, it's a little spooky.
Perfect for Halloween, right?
Yeah. So those are really interesting sources. And when we talked before, you were saying like it is hard to like hear, but it's not the words itself that we're focusing on right now, right?
Yeah, exactly. These are rare. By the 1930s, I mean, technology kind of did allow for people to start doing audio recordings of seances, but up until then, most recording of seances were written transcriptions. If you were lucky, you had somebody who could do shorthand, who could record a seance in shorthand so that it was very accurate to what the dialogue actually was. And what we have to remember with these sources is that they were produced for investigation purposes. So this is from the Society of Psychical Research, which is founded in 1882. And their goal is to kind of, so I mean, what's important to remember when listening to these recordings is that they were recorded for the purposes of investigation by what was called the Society of Psychical Research, or the SPR for short. And they were founded in 1882 to try and take seriously claims of spiritualism and psychics, and to investigate things like telepathy and ghost sightings and seances. And so these were recorded for the precise purpose of investigation, to try and understand what was happening at seances and try to understand what these spirit controls or these direct voice phenomenon were. So that's why they were recorded, and it was very expensive to do it, especially in the 1930s. So these are rare glimpses of spiritualism in the 1930s.
And so even though, you know, even though these are really difficult to hear, and you can see we also have a familiar here that obviously was just like, oh, spooky things. We're definitely going to. So even though these recordings are difficult to hear, what do you read from them as a historian? Like, if it's not the content, like, what is it, like, literally, but also kind of metaphorically and analytically, what do you read from a source like this?
So what I find interesting about it is it reminds you that the seance or spiritualism was a very sensuous experience. That, that this was something that involved the audio, the voices that came were important to the proceedings. If you're looking at seance transcripts or readings about seances from the period, you don't get that same impact of the audio. Well, what I find interesting about this is that I spent a lot of time in the archives reading these seance transcripts with Gladys Osborne Leonard, had known the Theta personality quite well, but it's something else entirely when you actually listen to these recordings. It brings out the kind of the personality, what other people, it brings us closer to the historical experience, essentially. And it reminds us that the seance is a sensuous experience, that it was something to be heard. And that, it's hard for us to put ourselves in the place of these people, but what it must have been like to hear from, a middle-aged woman, this kind of adolescent, childlike personality emanating through. It just brings us closer to what the actual seance experience was like during this period. And there's also, I think, really interesting things going on here with gender, especially in that second audio recording. She's putting out this masculine voice. So now we have a middle-aged woman acting as a middle-aged man or an elderly man. So you have in the same personality different identities, a child, a man. And so it kind of reminds us, one of the readings of spiritualism is that it is one way for women to transgress certain gender norms. So they could act more masculine, they could act more juvenile, they could be promiscuous. And you could say, well, that's not me. My body was literally being taken control of by another spirit. And so it kind of is one way to kind of transgress these gendered boundaries. But also by the 1930s, women are starting to become more controlled in the spiritualist movement as they become objects of investigation. So that's another thing that's going on here, is that they are literally being poked and prodded and stripped naked to make sure that they're not cheating. And so it becomes a really controlling environment, especially since most of the investigators are men. So there's these disturbing kind of gender dynamics that are happening here. And that's important to keep in mind when you're listening to these things.
That's interesting, because I immediately think of the witch trials. Right? Like, okay, you're saying that you do this, you have this, we're going to test it. It also makes me think of the institutionalization of things like childbirth, when you move from midwives to doctors because of this notion of witchery and, like other things. And that's kind of interesting, because I never would have put those together about ways that kind of that, not control of gender, but maybe a little bit of that, how that kind of institutionalization of these particular experiences are so gendered. As I say that, it seems ridiculous. I wouldn't have thought of that, but like, thank you for bringing that element of the analysis to the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of, on the one hand, there's a point to be made that this is kind of a liberating thing for women, because they can act as a spiritual authority. They can act as a scientific authority. They can play an important role in a spiritual movement. They're the centerpieces of it. But at the same time, there's not a lot of agency going on here, because it's not Gladys Osborne Leonard who is saying these things. It's Theta. It's the spirits. And it's also, she doesn't get credit for this because it's the investigators who get credit for it.
Right.
Right? They're the ones who are doing the recording. They're the ones that are doing the investigations. They're the ones that are writing up the reports. So they're the ones who are actually getting credit essentially for her work. And she can't really claim any credit without saying, you know, I'm a fraud, right? And I'm not saying she's a fraud, but if she tried to take credit for some of these emanations that are coming from the spirits, then she entirely discredits her entire her career, essentially. So it's kind of this give and take, and it's no surprise, and there's a lot that's been written about this, there's no surprise that by the 1950s, the spiritualist and psychical research movement as we know it kind of starts to become a little anachronistic and declines. And that's simply because women get more rights, right? So they don't need to be a medium in order to have some sort of spiritual or scientific authority necessarily.
Interesting. That's so interesting. Another element I wanted to pick up on your answer, which is a little bit broader about the sensualness of these recordings and how they kind of how they elevate archival material, because, you know, I think that sometimes we can fetishize certain types of primary sources, like ones in archives. I don't know if you heard that. That's a cat who was like, "Oh, what are we talking about?" That we can kind of fetishize particular types of primary sources, like the ones we find in the archives. And what that does is that puts a layer on history can be very clinical, really. And so, yeah, when you listen to these recordings, and of course those aren't always available, you are able to be transported, like, they're spooky. Like, what would that feel like? And so I guess, like, this isn't a question so much as a comment about, like, what are the other things? Like, this is a really good example of that. But what are the other, like, primary sources that we lose a lot of context from when we're not hearing them, right? Like, when we're not engaging in other sensatory experiences related to them?
Ah, that's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean,
it's
a rhetorical question. It's a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a question that really, like, resonates in this conversation, that I think is, like, cool to kind of, like, have there in our study of history. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how does a source like this challenge our traditional understandings of the 1930s, or even just, like, post World War I? And is one of those challenges, like, one of the ways that it challenges this period is to allow us to be able to hear this period differently, like, perhaps? But what are some other ways that this recording and recordings like this can challenge our understanding of this time period?
Well, in a couple of ways. I think for me, really, is that while these were made for the purposes of investigating spiritualism and psychical research and trying to prove them, or try to unite kind of science and the supernatural, which a lot of these investigators were trying to do, that's not their value anymore. That's why they were created. But we are not, even if we want to try and kind of prove these things, which I'm not even going to attempt to do, but even if I wanted to, I wouldn't really go here, right? You know, now there's a whole new field of parapsychology where they put it in labs and all that sort of stuff. Their value really is on kind of what they tell us about the 1930s. And I think what is interesting about them, especially from an educator's standpoint, if you're trying to train people to think historically, not necessarily historians, but undergraduate students and graduate students.
And high school students.
And high school students, absolutely. This is a great way to kind of challenge them to think historically, because listening to it, it's so absurd to us. I mean, the investigators seem very naive that they would think that this 13-year-old Feta character really was the spirit of an East Indian, or that it was really the voice of his deceased father. That to us seems kind of absurd to us today. So how do we kind of empathize with them, right? How do we kind of put ourselves into the 1930s, into this seance, and kind of understand where they're coming from? And I think it's a great way to kind of challenge people who are just starting to learn historically, because it is hard to do. But I think it reminds us that the line between science and the supernatural isn't always so clear, historically speaking, and that in certain historical contexts, things are more plausible than they are today. So we can kind of take it for granted that in the 1930s, that this was, that the idea that the dead could speak, or maybe possibly could speak, was a bit more plausible in the context. And that leads me to my second point, which is that these are kind of part of the long history of ghosts, but the modern ghost, and that is the psychologization, excuse me, of the ghost, the relocation of the ghost into the mind, where on the one hand you have people who are using kind of the language of psychology and science to say that this is all nonsense and that this is all illusions and hallucinations and so forth. But you also have, on the other end of the spectrum, who use those same methods and the same language to prove that these things really exist. And so this kind of exists in that awkward halfway between space, where you have these people who are trying to say, well, maybe there is something to this. Maybe the tools of science and psychology can prove that spirits actually exist. And that's where these audio recordings come from. That's their historical significance. And I think it is a kind of an interesting way to put history students into this dilemma of how do we empathize with the past, essentially.
Yeah, like one of the things I hear from your answer is, I mean, you didn't say this, but one of the things I'm extrapolating is like, it's not useful to use a source like this to just be like, was she channeling someone or not? Nor is this source useful to be like, hey, people in the 1930s were crazy, huh? But rather to like think about this period in this holistic way that involves these elements. And one of the things you had said was like, maybe the line between spiritualism and science is not as like distinct as we like to make it. And I would argue that that line between science and spiritualism is a line of race and gender and class, very much so, right? And so, I mean, just kind of more broadly, there may be students in a classroom that very much believe in some of these things as a key element of their epistemology, of the ways that they understand the world, and like having these conversations about them as ways to understand a historical period allow space for that into the classroom too, away from like this kind of Western, rational, scientific, disciplined way of understanding the world.
I'm glad you brought up race, because that's a really important part of this as well, right? It's no accident that Feda is supposed to be of East Indian descent. Most spirit guides were either said to be from India, they were said to be either indigenous people or from Africa. And there's a lot going on here with kind of race and imperialism. This is the period of the British Empire. And so it's this idea that ancient civilizations, or quote unquote, the primitive civilizations were more magical, but we're more scientific with our magic. So it's kind of this scientization of imperial ideas towards magic and the supernatural.
Yeah, and like, something very similar that you had said about gender too, right? Like, okay, we can make this more scientific and rational, because rational is often that term for maleness, for Western maleness in particular, white maleness, right? So yeah, those bring in so many interesting dimensions to this conversation. Thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you for introducing us to these really cool sound files and
no problem. Thank you so
things
much for
that
having
will
me.
literally haunt the rest of my day. But like for such a nuanced understanding of these recordings in relationship to a larger time period. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And again, the link to your podcast will be below, because even if it launches after this video goes up, I will make sure it's updated as soon as the link is ready for you. So
thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.